I'm here today with David Smick, the founder and president of Smick Johnson International and the founder and publisher of the magazine, The International Economy. Dave is an advisor to hedge funds and he's an author. This is his second book. The first, The World is Curved, was an extraordinary discussion of the great financial crisis, what led up to it and what went beyond. So, welcome.
Well, it's great to be here.
So you got a new book, The Great Equalizer, How Main Street Capitalism Can Create an Economy That Works for Everybody. How are we going to do that when the system is rigged?
Yeah, exactly. Why the book? I began writing it before the presidential election, and as I looked at the election, I was really curious about how Bernie Sanders was doing so well in the primaries against Hillary Clinton, and it dawned on me Sanders was making a case against capitalism that was quite effective, and it proved to be a case that was prophetic in the sense of, when you look at the rise of Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. But I looked at that and I thought, is the case against capitalism, or is it a case against what we allowed capitalism to become? Mm. And I began saying, do we really want to go back to Europe and to adopt their type of system? Probably not, given what's going on there. So I looked at what I call the corporate capitalism, the corporatist mindset that has taken over at Washington, in which everyone gets a special deal. You have banks that have completely distorted models. You have even our high-tech leaders, Google and Facebook, are now spending more on lawyers and lobbyists than they're spending on research. And I looked and thought, the system, even the Federal Reserve in response to the financial crisis, everything was biased in favor of the corporate, the established, the status quo, against the new, the young, the entrepreneurial, the inventive. It was against the little guy. And that's when it dawned on me that maybe it's not capitalism, the problem, it's what we've done to capitalism, and that there's a kind of Main Street capitalism, which is a little corny, but it's a Main Street capitalism in which the little guy has a chance to be part of this and to have a chance for a rising real income. And that's really what I wanted to get at and define that.
Well, at a time when 13 swing states, I believe 11 of them have lower median income than the day Obama was inaugurated, and when people are running around talking about the system is rigged, and they think Washington is like an insurance agency where we all pay a premium, but the rich and the powerful get accident insurance. I would say this is exploring whether this is a feasible alternative structure. It's an inspiring structure from my read of the book, but is it feasible? You've been a veteran of Washington. How are we going to get from here to there?
I think there is a bipartisan consensus that says, now I'm not saying on Capitol Hill everyone feels, but in the country, certainly centrists, people on the left, I think some on the right, not all, but I think there is an embarrassment about what's happened, about how the corporate interests have just taken over. And I think at some point in the future, there will be a leader who will bring both sides together and the middle. I guess what Bono called the radical center, will bring that and stand up, because, the current system is unsustainable. We're going to have a revolution if we're not careful, because if we don't increase real incomes for average people, and I sit there and I look and say, right now the stock market's been booming, and it's amazing how people say, oh my, the economy is really coming back. Well, it's coming back if you own a big stock portfolio.
I was going to say the symbolic economy.
But maybe somebody's in Youngstown, a working family's pension fund might be improving some, but their lives aren't improving yet. And I guess my sense is that the key to America having a prosperous economy for all has to do with more startups. We used to be a startup nation. Mm-hmm. We used to be a nation where average people would strike out on their own, and that's not happening. Startups are happening at half the rate that they were 15 years ago. And the one bright spot is that women are starting up companies at twice the rate of men. Oh. And also immigrants. If you're new to the country, you're starting up a firm at far more than twice the rate. So I think to me, the bright future is tied to unleashing the startups. I mean, I'll give you one example. You look at taxation and you say, the private equity guys on Wall Street, what do they get? They get a 15%, it's a little higher now, but for years, capital gains tax rate on carried interest, and they have made a fortune. The guy who owns, 5 or 2 dry cleaning operations, and he employs 100 people, or she employs 100 people, pays their taxes through and their subchapter S, they pay a tax rate almost or more than twice as high.
Yep.
So my question is, if we had a fair system, I would eliminate that favorable tax system treatment of carried interest. But apart from that, why can't the guy who has the subchapter S taxation, why can't he get the same rate as the Wall Street guy?
That's right.
And I think if you look throughout the system, the allocation of credit, the way it's the structure of our banking system now, which particularly since the financial crisis, we basically have a dozen zombie risk-averse banks that control 75% of all banking assets. So essentially the big get the loans, the little guy often not. And so that's the nature of this book. That's the message, which is that at some point the country is going to come together behind this notion that, and it sounds a little retro, but small is beautiful when it comes to an entrepreneurial vision. It comes to a vision of prosperity for all.
Well, this idea that you talk about, the kind of regenerative, the open startup, matters, I think, a great deal when people think about their children. Because we've been seeing for a few years people doing less well than their parents did, which is a new experience in the history of the United States. I don't mean in every year, but when you go for 15 years and that becomes the trend, there are a lot of people who say, I can take hardship, but as long as I'm delivering a system where my children will do better, I'll stay with it.
Yeah. Well, people ask me, why startups? Why do you fixate on that in your book? And it's one reason. Startups happen in America. A multinational corporation, 3/4 of the jobs produced are overseas. So I say if you want to bring the United States back economically, it's not just across the board tax cuts for everyone and the corporations get a cut in the tax rate. They ought to be fixating on startups. I mean, if Donald Trump were smart, he would forget all the all the other stuff he's doing and fixate on being a startup president. I doubt he will, but that's what he ought to be concentrating on, because that's really where the growth is going to come, and that's where the not just the growth, but the social mobility. I mean, the ability to and when you and I came along, you had a 25% chance if you were in the bottom 25 in the country, which is where I was. I grew up, parents in a blue-collar neighborhood. You had a 25% chance of rising to the top. Now you have a 5% chance.
Right.
But you can't increase social mobility without having this groundswell of firms that are just starting up. And you can see why, like it's even in Silicon Valley, there's a resistance to allowing the newcomers.
Pull up the drawbridge once you made it.
Exactly. They were the newcomers, and now they say, ooh, let's keep everyone at bay. And so that's the thinking of the book.
Well, looking at the present, there are a number of things that seem to irritate the public, probably none more than the cost of health. You talked about women, you talked about immigrants and others with startups. Is there a regional focus to the startups, or is it uniformly across the country?
I think we've had a fixation in this country when we mention innovation, we think Silicon Valley, or we think the half a dozen to a dozen satellites.
Austin, Texas, maybe.
Maybe. And I think that if you go back and look at history since the Enlightenment, what you see, it's really quite remarkable that the big jumps in per capita income were not tied to big innovation breakthroughs, technological breakthroughs, and they weren't even tied to infrastructure spending, canals, and all. I mean, you would think they would be, but it was not that those things aren't helpful and were not helpful, but the big jumps in per capita income came from during periods of mass flourishing.
You have a country that's founded on principles that work pretty well for a couple hundred years. And we've often benefited when the discord between how we're behaving and those principles puts a kind of a thorn in the heart of people, and they react to it. And that's been one of the strengths of the country. But we could get to a point in this crony capitalist rigged system world that you've been describing where people become despondent, and anybody who espouses those principles is called a romantic fool.
Yeah.
And then we lose that propulsion from the vision that the country was founded on. So I'm very grateful for your book because it's reinvigorating the vision. It's asking people to dig deep and reach out, not just to go do a startup. You're not telling people go run your head into a wall. You're talking about systemic changes that make it more viable for people to reach, we might call it their destiny, or how do say, get the brass ring that they imagine.
Well, one of President Obama's early advisors, Austin Goolsbee, read the book, and he said, this book, and he endorsed it, and he said, what it reminds me of is, he said, we've been knocked off the horse, and we think we can never get up again. And he said, what this book says is, let's dust ourselves off, and we can do this. We can get back on. And it's just a matter of will. It's just a matter of having the encouragement and having the confidence and having the leadership. Yep. So that's really so much of economics, as you know, is tied to the human element.
Yeah. Subjective, psychological.
It really is. It really is behavior.
Yeah.
Behavior is so much, and it's funny. It's so much of it doesn't fit on an Excel spreadsheet. You cannot, and I think that's where your group, I know, is really right at the cutting edge. You cannot model these things. The human behavior cannot fit in an econometric model. It's not predictive. That's why I think one of your major figures here, Joe Stiglitz, made a point that economists' forecasts are wrong 60 to 70% of the time. And when I saw that, I went and looked up and I said, that's the same accuracy rate of fortune tellers and tarot card readers. I said, not to be nasty toward economists, there are a lot of fine economists, but there is something. We are a society. We've been enamored of expert opinion, and what we're finding now, so much of our understanding was tied to kind of a math-related assumption, going back to Descartes, where we used mathematically we created symbols and began to believe in those symbols that they could define reality. They could define, and so it's what's interesting now, and I think what your group does well is that there are no. Every opinion we thought was the expert opinion, that the geniuses were we need to reevaluate because it turns out we need to be open to and trial and error, and that's why the whole bipartisan craze. I mean, the whole partisan craze in Washington drives me crazy. We shouldn't be sitting there, allowing, particularly in economics, the food fight to go on, where one side throws.
It's not related to anybody's well-being.
It isn't. It really is a matter of sitting down and saying, it's trial and error. I don't think that's going to work, but there's nothing wrong with you proposing that. We'll try this, but eventually we'll arrive at a model. But it's going to be trial and error. The expert opinion, they've had their shot, all sides, and look where we are.
Experts are on trial.
Yeah.
Well, as I'm listening to you today, I hear music of a couple varieties in my mind. One is recently deceased Leonard Cohen. Oh, yeah. When you talk about lack of certainty, he has a song called Anthem, and the chorus says, "Ring the bell you still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." And the other that reminds me of my children. I have 4 and 7-year-old daughters, as well as children in their 20s. But for the little ones, are running around my house singing a new song by a woman named Andra Day. And it's called Rise Up. And I think your book is urging us to rise up, and I thank you.
Great. Good to see you.
You too.